So I'm going to be talking to you about parody. We've had a lot of great presentations. A lot of people have used parodies. A lot of people have used original songs. And I think there's a lot of, reasons to use each of those different things. I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of what I do and, what I think some of the advantages and potentially disadvantages are of parody. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. So I thought I'd start off with a song. So before I get into this song, so usually I would deliver these songs after, at the end of the topic. So just a real quick description of epigenetics. So it's a bunch of stuff that goes on, that's passed on from cell to cell, that isn't stored in the A, T, Gs, and Cs of DNA, but is rather stored in other things, including whether some of those Cs are methylated, whether they have this extra methyl group stuck on. And when they are, they don't express their genes as much, and that gets passed on from cell to cell. Okay, so this tune is to Cat Stevens' Cat's Cradle. I had methylated feelings I couldn't express. I was DNA obscured by epigeneticness. My CPG island's a terrible mess. Cause block promoters, no transcription progress. But when I'd made two fresh strands all shiny and new, they said, I'm gonna be like you, Dad. I'm gonna be like you. And the genes are not all that get passed along. The daughter cell copies might sing the same song. We follow the paths our parental strands took. We're an annotated book, yeah. Our strands an annotated book. Okay, so real briefly, some of the things about that song that I'll be coming back to a little bit later on in terms of parody are that, it really is, in my mind, a parody, right? So it's not just a song that uses the tune from the original without, in a way that's divorced from the content of the original, right? Because the original song is about something that's being passed along to the child that is, it's not genetic, but it's based on these other factors. In this, the case of the actual song, it's, behavioral upbringing, right? But in this case, it's epigenetics. And I usually try and do that, and that's one of the advantages of parody. But, fundamentally, any discussion of why I particularly sing using parody has got to come back to Weird Al Yankovic, who I listened to a lot when I was a kid. In fact, I turned in the first assignment in a form of a parody in 5th grade, and I've never really turned back around from that. So I was heavily exposed to parody music, and that's really the reason why I use it. All the rest is explanations, that are post hoc for why this is a good idea that I'm doing this. So, I'm definitely a biased advocate for parody. But just to talk about parody, I want to mention one of the big things about parody songs, which is that they are fundamentally, at least they can be, easier, right? So it's easier to write a parody than a song under many circumstances. And that's because you've already got a tune, right? You don't have to write a new tune. And for many people who are not steeped in musical theory, which would include myself, this is a big advantage. I don't have a good idea about how to write a catchy tune, but I can steal someone else's and modify it for my purpose just fine. Now, I think this advantage, can be overplayed. It's not the only reason to be doing parody. And in fact, while I think it's a lot easier to write an okay parody song than an okay new song, I don't know that I think it's that much easier to write a great parody song than a great original composition. I don't think it's easier either. I mean, they're both very challenging things. They both require a lot of work, and they both have a lot of value. But it can be hard to write a good parody song. Okay, so when I'm going to be talking about parodies, I was putting this together. I put together my abstract a while ago. I was like, okay, what am I going to talk about here is going to actually be informative and interesting to a bunch of people who also teach using songs and know a lot of the stuff that I might otherwise talk about. And I was thinking, well, let's talk a little bit about familiarity. So I think this is one of the big advantages that parody songs have over other songs. And, you know, I want to be clear, like Jessica from before was talking about how you can use older songs. You can use, in some cases, songs that someone might, the students might not know. And, you know, in her version of this, what she does is she often plays the songs in advance, right? And I think that's a clever way of instilling some of that familiarity right off the bat. And also add, none of this stuff requires new songs because students are often familiar with old songs. In fact, they might be more familiar with them than the new hotness. And also, songs will age more if you use old familiar songs than if you use new familiar songs. But this familiarity, I think, has a lot of advantages to helping out with a lot of potential goals we might have in using songs for educational purposes. So again, we've discussed a lot of different possible goals, which are not mutually exclusive that for educational teaching. But I just want to touch on a few. You know, we can talk about engagement, we can talk about memory, and we can talk about resonance. So let me get into each of these sort of in turn. So first, engagement. So we want our students to be invested in what they are being exposed to. You know, the low-hanging fruit is your students enjoying it when you sing a song, right? That's a low-hanging fruit because everyone loves it when an authority figure stands up in the front of the room and does something silly, right? So that's the easy stuff. Of course, the goal is to make them actually engaged in the material as opposed to just the silly things that the educator's doing. But it's a good idea to at least know the students are engaged in something. And so I did an assessment back a few years ago where I did a survey after singing a number of songs throughout my course. And just to talk you through how to read this, in the upper left-hand corner, you know, there's the color coding, but essentially on each one of these, for each one of these questions, the darker green is strongly agree, lighter green is people who answered agree to these questions, yellow would be neither agree nor disagree, orange would be disagree, and red would be strongly disagree. And so in each of these cases, I've written the percentage that strongly agreed or agreed above the bar. And so, you know, the first song was this question here, the songs were a helpful break from lecture that allowed me to refocus my attention. So, you know, unsurprisingly, students found me starting to sing a song that gave them kind of a break, you know, again, kind of low-hanging fruit. Second question, the songs made me feel more engaged in the class. So this is maybe getting a little more at a bit of a higher level sort of engagement. You know, it's engaged in the class and, you know, still a lot of students agreeing with that. So I have some personal evidence based on student surveys that, you know, that my parody songs, since my songs are almost entirely parody, are engaging. But let's talk about familiarity and engagement more specifically. So 12.7% of the student comments on the music surveys mentioned familiarity. And that's despite the fact that, you know, I didn't have any questions about familiarity. I wasn't really thinking about that when I put together the survey. But the students clearly were. Many of them mentioned that, you know, we like having familiar songs. You know, it was interesting seeing these songs that we knew played in this other context. I had a lot of comments like that. And I was looking around for some research on engagement and familiarity, and I found actually, you know, one interesting source of information on sort of music and a lot of things which we actually care about comes interestingly from like the marketing world, because they do a lot of studies on things like jingles and stuff like that. So I found some really interesting stuff looking at people thinking about how to, advertise for something, because, essentially we're looking for market share in students' brains, right? That's one of the things we want. And, what they find might be relevant to us as well. So I found a paper that talks about basically whether students prefer familiar songs. And without getting into the details here, just look at the slope of these graphs. So down at the bottom, we have the familiarity with the song. So as that gets to a larger number, we're talking about more familiarity. And on the other axis, we have the probability of choosing the song. And we see that when students were offered a choice between two songs, they pretty overwhelmingly chose the song that they were familiar with. So, again, what students will choose in a vacuum is not the only thing that we should consider when we are trying to do education with music. But, I suspect that any of this sort of preference might potentially be, if anything, stronger when we're talking about, students who are also being bombarded with a bunch of unfamiliar and, more complicated science jargon at the same time they're trying to hear these songs. I think there's a good, though, undemonstrated argument to be made that familiarity might be especially important when there's also some sort of information that the student is relatively less familiar with, or that is stressful to be trying to understand, also presented at the same time.
Hey, Rick, we have a question that popped up. It says,
yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about the full model that's actually in your graph?
Oh man, okay, so yes, so let's see. So this is not mine, I emphasize, but the full model is controlling for like, cool, and regret. And so basically, students also answer questions like, do you like these songs, right? Do you think this song is cool? Do you think you'll regret it if you listen to the other song? So they asked all those questions. And even when they controlled for all those things, even when they controlled for what the students said they liked, what the students thought was cool, and what the students thought they would regret missing out on, they still found that there was a fairly strong correspondence between familiarity and the probability of choosing the song. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So again, I'd have to look back at the paper to be sure of any more details than that, like the exact nature of those other questions, but that's approximately what it was. Okay, so this speaks to the fact that familiarity may improve engagement. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about memory. So as we've been discussing, memory is not the only thing we want to get out of music education, but it's also a thing that students care about, students think about, and it's a thing that educators think about too, as a thing that music might be helpful for. Okay, so real quick, just sort of my assessment. You can look at this. First of all, one thing you might notice is not a huge percentage of my students said the songs helped them memorize the terms. I suspect that many of the other songs written by many of the other educators at this meeting, they would have better results from this, or I should say at least higher results from this. And I think that has something to do with the sort of songs that I write, which are less likely to walk students carefully through sort of terms and things like that, and more likely to be sort of conceptual. And I don't mean that as an insult to these other things, which I think are great and which are really good at nailing down exactly what's going on. I think that's it's a weakness of my approach that is perhaps not as good for memory as some of these other approaches. So students thought, 57% said that it helped them memorize a term. So it may have had some positive effect for some reasonable proportion of them on memory. Okay, so oops, my animation's off here, but I was looking up papers on familiarity and memory, and I did not find a lot of stuff that was really very compelling evidence for the role of familiarity and memory. I was thinking like people are going to have found that familiarity is helpful to memory. That's kind of obvious, and it might well be out there. I might have just missed it in my cursory search. But I didn't find much. And what is there is largely on sort of very young students, again, who maybe people have thought more about using music in education with these very young students. But there's not a lot on that in older learners. And let's see. The second paper down below, which looked at the effect of pitch, rhythm, and familiarity on working memory and anxiety. I was like, oh, well, here we go. And they found actually not a very large effect. It was not a significant effect, in fact, of familiarity on working memory. So they did not find that if they played a familiar tune, that it resulted in in better recall. It was in the direction, but it was not at all significant. So, well, actually, it was less than 0.05 p-value. So, some less stringent researchers might have said that was significant, but it's not very strong evidence that I personally found in this literature search for that connection, despite the fact that I would think that there would be such a connection. So next, let me talk about resonance. So I like resonance as a term for this idea because it's a pun, because, it has to do with music. But if we talk about resonance as the power to evoke enduring images, memories, and emotions, then I think that this is one of the really great things that music education has the potential to add, right? If we can make students really think about this stuff, we can make these ideas reverberate around in students' heads. I think that's really valuable. And music has a potential to approach things from sort of a different direction than a lot of our other instruction, and that may be a valuable thing. So in terms of assessment, and I didn't ask my students about resonance because I wasn't thinking about that term when I put together the survey, and I'm not sure they would have known quite what I meant by that anyways. But remember before, I had not so many students who thought the songs helped them memorize terms, and I did have a higher proportion of students who did think the songs helped them understand the material, and that might get something at resonance. But to discuss resonance a little more, I was thinking about resonance, this sort of deep, it might be sort of a deep memory, right? It's kind of engagement and memory combined are one of the things that results in resonance. So things that improve either one of those may improve resonance. And one of the reasons that resonance may be pretty important in my mind is that it helps build connections between STEM and self, right? So it allows students to build connections between sort of the rest of their everyday life and these STEM issues and questions. There's been a lot of studies done on utility value interventions in which students write up something about how some science concept applies to their everyday life, and that actually has a really kind of amazing and ongoing effect on their sort of academic performance, retention, all sorts of things like that. So I think there's a lot to be said for just sort of connecting stuff that students are familiar with in their everyday lives and these STEM concepts. And it may be the case that these songs that, especially if they are based off of some sort of music that is familiar to them in their everyday life, that might help build those connections and be advantageous in that way, right? So, engagement and memory together may be more than the sum of their parts. And I feel like, similarly, music and education and content can be more than the sum of their parts in a way. Okay, so how do we get this familiarity? There's a citation for utility value intervention. How do we get this familiarity? Well, one thing is we can choose songs that students know, right? And again, we've had some people saying here, I think quite rightly, you don't have to choose songs students know, right? Students can get value out of any of these sorts of things, and you can always steal a really useful tune and one that's really going to stick in students' head and get a lot of value out of that. But there's, insofar as familiarity may be some advantage, choosing songs that students know may be helpful. Now, the point was also made that like the new songs, very often, students a couple years from now, when you're still going to want to be using that song you spent a lot of time writing, they're going to be like, I don't know what that song is anymore. And so I look at things like top 100 wedding song lists I find online and just all sorts of top lists, and I look for old songs sort of specifically, because if there's an old song that has stood the test of time and people still know it, first of all, it's probably a pretty catchy song. It's probably a pretty good tune to steal. And secondly, it's more likely to then continue sticking around and being known to your students for quite a while, so you can keep using those songs and not waste a lot of effort. And again, you can also create this familiarity perhaps by playing the songs at the beginning of class. I think that's a great idea as well. Another way you can seek familiarity and kind of use familiarity is to use the mood, theme, and topic of the song. So really take from what the song is giving you. The song gives you all kinds of things to inspire you and help you write something that is going to be resonant to your students. And if you use what the song gives you, I think it makes sense to the students that your song would be, the topic ties into what you're singing about. So I think building that connection, which is missing in some parody songs, and again, I don't think that's a disaster, but using that connection really helps cement ideas in the minds of your students. I also really like to use stories and characters because students like them, and students like people, like everyone, and we have good memories for how people work and how stories work. So if you can tell a story, then that's valuable. And there's a number of ways to do this. Actually, I talked about that at Voices last year, so you can look at my talk there if you want to hear more about my defense of anthropomorphism in songwriting. One more thing about, really using the mood, theme, and topic of the song is that if you're worried about the whole fair use issues with parody songs, I mean, if you're really parodying them, if you really are tying in what you're teaching to what they're providing, what they're giving you, then, you greatly bolster your case for the fact that what you're doing is fair use. And you can write all kinds of things, like, all kinds of popular songs are about things coming together or separating, movement or stasis, and those things are hugely important to biology, to physics, and you can often find ways to make those connections. Okay, so I thought I'd end with one more song that's really much more about resonance than content. And I sing this for my research methods class to help them kind of really feel the plight of the researcher who's going through like a PhD or something like that. And it's to the tune of Britney Spears' Hit Me Baby One More Time. Plot the data one more time. Oh, data, data, how was I supposed to know that something wasn't right here? Oh, messy data in regressions, your R squared's low. And your p-values are high, yeah, show me a pattern that I can see. Tell me data, cause I need to know now, because I spent a year hanging out in lab, even weekends, burned through the money on my PS grant. Out of cash, if I can't publish, I'll lose my mind. Give me a sign. Plot the data one more time. Oh, data, data, how was I supposed to know? I should have modified my protocols 3 years ago. Whoa, 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 whoa. I must confess that this total mess is getting me down. But don't you know I still believe there's a pattern here that I just might find. Plot the data one more time. All right. And incidentally, those statistics members in the audience might be like, well, that's kind of hacking. Okay, I wrote this song before that was people were thinking as much about that. And I talk about that after I sing the song, because you don't want to be just plotting the data and trying to search out data in it. But I felt like that a lot of the time as a grad student. All right, so that's it. Thank you, everyone.
I can actually relate to that as a grad student. I liked that. And I also recently just read your article that was published, and I actually used it for my own prospectus. And interestingly, I remember in your article, you said that you like to not usually use the music, that you actually just kind of freestyle it like you did here. And I was curious to know if you have a rationale behind that.
My rationale is it takes a lot less work for me in a lot of ways, because I'm pretty confident singing a cappella, for better or for worse. And I don't play any instruments. Obviously I just got a ukulele and I'm going to practice it a little. So I'm in the ukulele crew.
There you go. Seems to be a popular instrument.
But I don't know how to play it yet. So I could get karaoke tracks, and I've considered doing that, but I'd then have to trim them down, as Mary was discussing, and so for me, it's just easier this way. And also, I advance through the slides, and I have annotations that I use to show like what I'm talking about. And if I were like playing an instrument or something, that'd be hard to combine in. It means I can start at whatever tempo I want. I can be like, oh, we're running out of time in this class. I'm going to go at a fast tempo today.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious. I've actually used that idea of the annotation this year after your presentation last year, and I had a completely different reaction for the better. So it seems to make a huge difference. Like, so when I talked about, the ideal gas law, then I wrote the equation over there, and it seems to make a huge difference. So I think that there is something to that, definitely.